Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome and thank you for finding the time to attend our Christmas lecture today. My name is Charlie Nicklin and I'm the CEO of I Agree, and I'll be your host today. I'd like to welcome Paul Henderson as our guest speaker today, who is going to talk about the life and works of the little-known inventor and engineer Frederick Lanchester. Paul has been part of the Lanchester Interactive Archive outreach team since its inception in 2017. Paul is a former science teacher and charity communications specialist. He's been taking Fred's story from primary schools to dementia cafes via events like the NEC Classic Car Show and now, of course, online. Paul is based at Coventry University and he's recently learnt to drive the latest acquisition to the archive, a 1932 Lanchester limousine. Just before Paul starts, some house rules. You are all currently muted. If you would like to ask questions, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and then at the end of the presentation, we'll unmute you so you can ask your question. So with no further ado, over to you, Paul.
Brilliant. Thank you, Charlie, and thanks for the invitation to talk. I'm just going to share my screen, so hopefully you can see the slides. Let me just start that. Make sure I've got the right screen shared. That. Let me just double check I've got this working because that's share the screen. Did have this working. There we go. Yeah, we've got that. I'll just make sure I'm sharing the right one, that's all. So you should see, just scrolling behind me there, just one or two of Fred's inventions and some of the things that he's known for. When I started the job, I didn't know anything about Fred, and normally when I'm sort of teaching things, you ask sort of people where to start and to just give an idea of where you're up to. But it's probably the way that I'm going to try and race through an awful lot of stuff today, because there's so much to get through. But I will make no apologies for going as quickly as I can. But we will go as fast as we can. There we go. Sorry. So, who was Fred? Why is he here? What's the exhibition about? What's the archive about? And what I'm going to do is just talk a little bit to begin with about the connection with Coventry University, because if you do know anything about Fred or Lanchester, you might know about the cars and car factories. So Lanchester cars were produced in Birmingham until 1931. We're actually coming up to the 90th anniversary of the switch from Birmingham to Coventry. I'll talk a little bit about that later on. And eventually the Lanchester College of Technology was opened in 1961 and was named after Fred, which became Lanchester Polytechnic and then Coventry University in 1992. The space was open, the library in which the space was opened in 2001, and our project was opened in 2017 as part of a Heritage Lottery funded project to bring his collection to life. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about Fred, they sort of chronologically, but we'll sort of bob around all over the place, and there'll be time for questions at the end later as well. So I'm going to rewind back to 1868. Fred was born, one of 9 or 8 surviving siblings in 1868 in Lewisham. It was quite funny. We had a student we've got a timeline in the LIA space, and she was wandering along, and she just stopped at one of the timelines, said, "Wow." I said, "Oh, what's that?" I said, "Fred." I said, "Yes." He said, "He was born in Lewisham." I said, "Yes, he was born. He wasn't born in Coventry." That's one of the things people often ask us, is whether he was born in Coventry. He said, "No, he was born in Lewisham." He said, "I was born in Lewisham." I said, "Oh, that's very nice. No one famous is from Lewisham." but which isn't entirely true, because actually there's quite a few musicians. Bros, Sid Vicious, Bill Wyman were all born in Lewisham, Jessica Hines, Alexander McQueen. But so far, Fred is one of the more famous people we think who was born in Lewisham. And you might not be able to see this in terms of the family tree, but there's, as I say, he was one of 7. I'll put a highlighter on here. There we go. 7 brothers and sisters, and 2 of his brothers he worked very, very closely with, Fred and Frank and George, and they became known as the unholy trinity for working together on Sundays and making all sorts of noise and all sorts of things like that. But he had lots of other brothers and sisters. Probably the most sort of notorious or famous was his sister Edith Lanchester. And she was born in 1871, and in 1895 she decided she has a relationship with a guy called James Seamus Sullivan. She fell in love with him, and when she was decided, she was quite a brilliant and principled suffragette. She actually studied maths at London Polytechnic, and after a year of teaching, became a secretary to Eleanor Marx, Karl Marx's daughter. She was a speaker at rallies as well. She fell in love with James Sullivan, and in 1895 they decided they would live together, which did not go down well. She simply believed that she wouldn't want to follow the vows of honouring and obeying someone. So she decided to not get married. And on the night before they were not going to get married, her father gathered with 3 of the brothers, including Fred, and talked to her about the fact that she was going to get married, not going to get married. And she was given she was pronounced insane, with the father dragged a doctor in to give a sign of was insane, and the reason for the insanity was over-education. Now, she was kidnapped by the family, taken off to the an asylum, which is now the Priory Clinic, and this was reported all over the world. And eventually her MP was contacted. Even the Marquis of Queensberry offered her £100, which would be about £12,000 today, as a wedding present if she would go through with the ceremony. But she was eventually released with the reason she was under the Lunacy Act, saying that she was sane but foolish. So she was released eventually. Now, she did. She never spoke to the family again. But her son was Waldo Lanchester, who was a puppeteer, and her daughter was Elsa Lanchester, the Hollywood actress who played the Bride of Frankenstein and also appeared in Mary Poppins as the Nana in Mary Poppins. She married another Hollywood actor, Charles Lawton. That's not Charles Lawton on the right, that's Boris Karloff, but this is Charles Lawton. So the whole family is quite, and I could go on about that, but the whole family is quite fascinating. But he started off quite spectacularly, really. And in his memoirs, he made a note saying, "I was not known to utter an articulate sound before I was 2 3/4 years of age, and then startled the world by blurting out one word, egg." Now, the woman doctor who was in charge of the infant clinic says that the knowledge of my case has been great and frequent service to her, having enabled her to pacify mothers who are getting anxious of their offspring or a trifle behind in that direction. She tells them that one of their greatest scientific engineers never spoke a word till nearly 3 years of age, and I suspect, she adds, she made up for it since. So he went on to get a national scholarship at the Normal School of Science, which is now part of Imperial College, where he studied physics and chemistry, mining, all sorts of things, but got to his final year and was taking evening classes because he really didn't feel like the education was carrying on and suiting him. So he eventually left there, but unfortunately left without any qualifications. And so he went and got a job at a patent office, and this was his first job as a draftsman, and this coincides with his first patent. So he was just 20 years of old when he got his first patent, which is this machine here, the isometrograph, which William has been actually making a replica of. from those original patents. And this was just first of over 200 patents that he had during his lifetime. And so it showed he sort of knew the system, but obviously having no job or no qualification, that's when he really needed the job at the patent office. He moved in 1889 to Birmingham to start at the Ford Gas Engine Company with his brother George. And his brother George was actually an outstanding engineer. And when he employed George was only about 18 at the time, and he put George in charge of about 60 men in the workshop. So he had high value for his colleague George. And this was at the point where he went across to America with the Ford Gas Engine Company, and really inspired his fascination with flight. And while he was going across on the boat to America, he noticed the flight of the birds and how the birds would seem to fly alongside the boat without making any sort of effort, just soaring along on the wind. And he wondered whether he could make a machine that could fly, a wing that could fly. When he came back in 1894, he started with some experiments from his house in Alton near Solihull, and you can see on the wings here. He built several gliders. Some of them are powered like this, which had rubber bands and two propellers on this one. And he was really interested in stability of flight. But you can see very clearly this elliptical wing shape, which is very reminiscent of the Spitfire wing shape, which Mitchell credits Lanchester for. But this is 40 years before Mitchell's ever drawn a Spitfire. So he started these experiments and went on to complete the experiments. The house is still there. It's St Bernard's Road, called Fairview. And he'd do this from the first floor. And as I say, he did it with his brothers who would do the measurements with him. And these are some of the results. So you can imagine what this looked like in 1894 with houses, these huge gliders being thrown from the back window of his house, and some of them would go 200 to 300 meters over the roads. Some of them didn't always work. Some of them turned back, and you can see from his results this is what it would look like today. So they were going huge distances, and from his results, as I say, didn't always work, but he did record his results. Although, when we do this with sort of schools and things, sometimes they didn't even write down the dates, so it was a little bit vague on there. So we say that if they write down the dates, they're one ahead of Fred on that one. And as I say, some of them also collided with a tree. But these were this first sort of description of this what's called phugoid motion. And some real fundamental theories of flight he was developing here. He was also experimenting with little winglets. Now we see today on jets these winglets which save fuel, reduce drag, but he came up with some of these, and this is a patent from 1907. But he was experimenting with different winglets again well over 100 years. So it comes back to another theme with Fred of being way ahead of his time. The problem was this was 1894, and there really was this is another 9 years before the Wright brothers flew. There really were no commercial business models for building flying machines. He was called a madman for doing it. So he switched his attention to the road and to the water. And this is probably the thing he's best known for, which is developing the first all-British four-wheeled petrol motor car, and in 1895. And again, when we talk to the children about this, we get them to sort of say what sort of things this might be missing. And they come up with all sorts of things, like it's missing a radio, or it's missing a windscreen, it's missing that sort of stuff. But it is missing a steering wheel. It uses tiller steering, which pretty much all the early cars used. And they're used until the bodywork started coming up, and it was a little bit awkward. But it's really, I've had a go with a tiller steering car, and they're pretty light steering actually, and you can drink and drive. You can have one hand with something to drink, and you only have to operate it with one hand. So it's pretty useful. At the same time, He stuck a petrol engine into a motorboat and came up with the first all-British motorboat. This was mainly because he was testing his cars and he knew they would go over the speed limit. And so he was testing his engines inside the cars. Let's skip over that one. So when it came to flying machines, he was still developing the idea of flying machines in the background while the car business was beginning to take off. And this is one of his most interesting patents from 1897 for a machine that he never got to build. But it's quite a remarkable machine. And at the university, we've had some students who've been working hard to see whether this machine could be flown. And this is a seater from a couple of years ago who took the patent and modeled the design on the computer. And you can see on the top right-hand corner what the machine would have looked like compared to something like the Wright Brothers Flyer. It's totally different. It's got such a slender wing shape, contra-rotating propellers, which we see on machines much later on, and these big sort of fins that go up there. And what Asita modelled was that not only would the plane would have flown, definitely would have flown, he said, without a shadow of a doubt, he would have flown, because he can actually fly it on the simulator once you plugged all the numbers in. The aerofoil design was particularly advanced. It would have had 50% more lift than the Wright Brothers plane, and was equivalent to an aerofoil maybe in the 1940s or 50s. So if Fred had been able to build this in 1897, I think everyone would have heard of him, because he would have beaten the Wright Brothers by a good 5 or 6 years. But the research sort of continues, and hopefully we're going to be making some models of this. One of my colleagues, Chris Clark, who's written several books about the Lanchester, says he's got a pilot who is willing to fly a full-scale model. So rather him than me, but if you fancy flying in a design from 1897, because there's so much, because it's only a patent, we don't have any blueprints, so we've literally just got the few pages from the patent. So there are some things like, why are these contra-rotating propellers offset, and these big fins? What Asita says is that the fins make it fantastically stable for forward flight, but turning corners in it is a nightmare. So there's pluses and minuses with it, but it's a really interesting design, and something that looks just like a modern drone and not something from 1897. It's streamlined, it's a monoplane, it's quite a remarkable design. So going back to the cars, and something which if you've driven in a car today, you will have or encountered pretty much on every single car that or vehicle that there is, and that would be this thing here. So this piece of panel that's on, this is the second car, which is down in storage, unfortunately, at the moment in Broughton in the Science Museum. And this is a piece of machinery which, I say, we see on every single car. It's the dashboard. It's the piece of board to stop the dash coming up from the road. And he patented this in 1901. And it folds out of the way and just stops the dash. And that's where the word dashboard comes from. So the cars, those original cars really were prototypes, and he formed the Lanchester Engine Company to start putting these things into production. And the first production cars, and you can see that although the tiller steering started, you could start to get steering wheels pretty early on. And some of the older Lanchester owners, when the cars started coming out, actually preferred the tiller steering. So you could have it as an option. You could have a steering wheel, or you could have tiller steering. And there are quite a few of those very early cars still on the road. This one, FRW 766, is owned by the Jaguar Heritage Daimler Trust, and is still on the road, as would have done the London to Brighton run this year. This is from a couple of years ago. And this picture here is two of Fred's brothers, George and Frank, at an event at the coronation. So one and the same car, which is still a really nice connection to the family and that original car. And the cartoon is one that Fred did, which is says modestly, what England thinks today, Lanchester thought of years ago. And they weren't afraid of a publicity stunt back in the early days of motoring. And this was at a motor show in 1903. at Crystal Palace, and their driver, Archie Millership, took the car and drove it up the steps of Crystal Palace to show off the suspension and the transmission. And this is not something I'd like to do in my car today, but because of the way the suspension works, the front wheels are thrown out quite far in front of the front of the car, so it means it can go up an incredibly steep slope. And this was recreated in 1995 up the steps of Coventry Cathedral. And they took a car and did exactly the same thing at the top of Coventry Cathedral. Then they realized they couldn't get it out to the top, and they had to drive it back down the steps as well. So they managed to do that, but it just shows the quality of the suspension and the transmission that they were able to do that back in 1903. The first production car went in 1905, which is a 20 horsepower. And George, Fred's brother, patented these driving goggles, and we have the only pair of those in the world that are in the Lanchester collection. And they're actually made of mica, not plastic, they're mica and see-through, and they have a little bit of foam at the bottom to stop them steaming up, which is probably something we could do today with all the mask wearing that's going on. He did eventually publish his work on aeronautics and aerodynamics, but obviously there's a 10-year gap, and things had moved on. So in some ways, where he was to give a talk in 1894 to one of the Birmingham societies, and he was almost sort of laughed at as they didn't take him seriously, but he did eventually publish his work, and they became quite fundamental pieces of work. But he did work on aeronautics a little bit more. And interestingly, doing some research for the talk I did to Friends of Ferguson Heritage, there was a really interesting link with Harry Ferguson. So in 1909, Fred went to see the Wright brothers fly in France, and he also went to a huge aviation show in Reims in August. And he was interested in it, and he was not carried away by the enthusiasm there, but he noted a lot of the designs and was very interested. At the same event, now this was an event over a week, so we don't know quite whether this happened, but Harry Ferguson, who was the first Irishman to build and fly his own plane, also went to that event in Reims. Now, I don't know, they might have met up, who knows? But they both put together designs for a plane. And as you can see here, Ferguson's monoplane and Lanchester's monoplane are pretty similar. They're not a million miles apart. So they went forward with their designs. Now, Ferguson's was successful. As I say, he flew his, but unfortunately, Lanchester's was not as successful and crashed on its first flight. But we've had a group down in Coventry, Menshed down in Coventry, who've been building a fantastic replica of this, and hopefully we're going to be able to put it on display in our space. But if planes and automobiles weren't enough, he also took his attention to trains as well. And this is quite a unique vehicle as well. So this is his first foray into petrol-electric hybrid vehicles. He had a patent in 1910 for a petrol-electric propulsion vehicle. And it's when you look at the patent, it's fantastic. He nails what hybrid power is in one line. And it's exactly the same as a Toyota Prius today, but this is, over 110 years ago, this first patent. But his first patent was actually for this, which was a rail car, which he developed with Daimler. And it went on lots of test runs throughout the Midlands. It eventually, the war stopped production of it. But they tested it, and one of the potential customers was possibly going to be in Zimbabwe for Rhodesia Railways. But they never got put into production. But the idea of petrol-electric hybrid vehicles came back a few years later, and I'll talk a bit about that later. The war came, and Lanchester armoured cars were developed, sent to Belgium and the Russian front as well. And a group in Belgium reenactors in Belgium have made a full-scale replica of the car, quite cramped inside, but quite reliable and certainly the first time that an armored vehicle had been made, not based on a truck, but based from an armored vehicle from the ground up. He wrote another seminal piece on the aircraft in warfare, and he really foresaw during the First World War, aircraft were being used a little bit for reconnaissance, but a little bit for occasional bombing missions. But he could see the future that aircraft would be the center of warfare. They would be used throughout as a new, he called it the fourth arm of warfare, and developed many strategies as well, which would be explained later. In 1919, just after the war, he married the niece of his voice coach, Dorothea Cooper. She was 30 years younger than him, but that's not terribly surprising given the ravages of war. There are a lot of younger women marrying older men, and they got married in September that year. But they had to interrupt their honeymoon because, in final recognition, he was ordered an honorary doctorate. So remember back, he didn't have any qualifications, and he eventually was awarded this honorary doctorate by Birmingham University. And we've got some really nice letters going backwards and forwards in the collection as he interrupts his honeymoon to come back for his degree congregation about getting different sizes. And he was very pleased with this, and his family still refer to him as Dr. Fred in recognition of this. Now, the Lanchester Company weren't particularly interested in racing cars, but some privateers took some cars and took them around Brooklands, and some fantastic names of the cars. This streamlined car was driven by Tommy Hann. It was called "Away, Where You Going To," and was redesigned the following year and renamed "Softly Catchy Monkey." And in 1924, the cars broke numerous world records going around Brooklands, and there's a few films of this, which is quite frightening. And one of the telling things for me is that in less than sort of 30 years, going from a car that frankly doesn't look very much like a car, looks more like a carriage, to going to something which will average 100 miles an hour around Brooklands is one of the huge leaps of technology in terms of, internal combustion engines and what have you. So that's a massive one for me in terms of the progress and the technology that he was able to develop. He did have a brother. His father was an architect, and he had a brother who was an architect as well. And he got his brother to design him a house in Birmingham in Moseley. But when it came to the designs, he wasn't happy with the designs, so he ripped them up and designed his own house, which is still there today in Dyot's End. So again, one of the ways that he was never satisfied, always a perfectionist, and probably somebody quite difficult to get on with. But he carried on and built and designed his own house in Moseley, which is still there and got a little green plaque on it. And in the 1920s, Lanchester cars were competitors for Rolls-Royce, sometimes a little bit more expensive than Rolls-Royces. They were cars of royalty, and they were exported all over the world, especially to some of the richest men in the world, who were the Maharajas in India. And there was a very strong royal connection, because the Duke of York, who became George VI, who's standing there, was a huge fan of Lanchester cars. And when he was chosen when he came to visit Coventry in 1938, the person who was going to show him around is Frank Lanchester, Fred's brother there in the background. And they were employed by a royal appointment. They got a royal warrant to produce cars like this one. So there were a pair of cars that were produced for his for state use, but then also some personal use as well. And you can see here that there's the Queen Mum, and there's George there, and there's Margaret and Princess Elizabeth, our Queen Elizabeth II there. And this is the Queen Elizabeth's first car, and she actually went on honeymoon in a Lanchester as well. There are newspaper reports of that. As long as Prince Philip wasn't driving, I think we'd probably be all right. But he was. They apparently had lots of fun on their honeymoon in their Lanchester. But they weren't the only royal family to enjoy Lanchesters, and this is the Maharaja of Nawanagar and his collection of Lanchesters. And basically, whenever a new Lanchester would come out, he'd buy a new Lanchester. So this is just one Maharaja's collection of Lanchesters, and that building in the background is a motor house. They'd all have their own chauffeurs, and they were particularly good because of the transmission that they had, they were particularly good at going at really slow speeds. So they were able to go in slow processions with elephants and not overheat. So really useful when you're in the hot climate. But you could specify anything with the Maharaja's cars. You could have gold inlay, you could have silk, and they would have cost the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of pounds in today's money. He developed some side projects as well, so speakers, amplifiers, Lanchester Laboratories Limited, to develop anything that was non-automotive. And I mentioned the petrol-electric hybrid car. Well, this is the one-off prototype that he made, which is in the Think Tank Museum in Birmingham. And this was developed in 1927. This is the Mark 7. They have a Mark 8 engine as well. We've got lots of drawings and diagrams in the collection about petrol electric. It would have gone at 45 miles per gallon. So again, way ahead of his time. Never went into production because it probably would have been too expensive when compared to something like an Austin 7 that came out around the same time. But he got really obsessed with the idea of petrol electric power and wanted to take the technology to its limits. His eyesight began to fail, so he got interested in that as well. So he struck up a friendship with the professor of anatomy, Professor Lockhart, and wrote some papers, including things about the discontinuity of vision. So there was nothing really that would not interest him and keep him excited and interested. In 1931, we're coming up again to the 90th anniversary. It's around this time of year, and it was quite a wrench in terms of there was the Lanchester company was based in Birmingham, was struggling a bit with the depression and like all companies were, and had some loans out, and the BSA, which is the large group of Birmingham Small Arms, large group of companies which owned Daimler at the time, were sniffing around trying to see whether they could pick off the best bits of Lanchester, and eventually persuaded their bank, who had the same bank, to foreclose on the loan, this fairly small loan that they had, and effectively snapped Lanchester up for an absolute song. And if you look at the newspaper reports of the time, that there's lots of newspaper reports of, interestingly, the Birmingham newspapers talking about the closure of the factory and being a really bad thing. It only happened in a matter of weeks in sort of January 1931, whereas the Coventry newspapers are all positive about the fact that all these jobs are coming to Coventry, because very few people actually transferred across. So they effectively got absorbed by BSA and moved to the Daimler factory, which was already existing in Coventry. He wrote some poetry as well. He wrote some poetry, but he did it under a pseudonym because he felt that engineers would not be able to be taken seriously if they were writing poetry, and vice versa. And it's something we talk to with the kids today, is that, well, he had to do it under a pseudonym, but really you shouldn't be limited like that. You should be able to write poetry and do everything you can. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and it's one of the things in the collection we have. You can see the deterioration of his handwriting, and eventually his wife was typing up his notes for him. Now, if we go back to that car in the 1895 car, when they transferred to Coventry, this car was just put into the factory and was basically on the factory floor. The apprentices used to eat their lunch out of it. It wasn't thought of being very important. Daimler opened up a museum and put the Daimler cars in there, but they left the Lanchester cars in the factory. And on the 14th of November 1940, of course, as part of the Coventry Blitz, this factory was bombed. And this map at the top here is the map of the factory. It's a huge site. This is the equivalent map today. And it was bombed ruthlessly. And each one of these red dots is where one of the high explosive bombs dropped. And all this black area was the bit that was burnt out. And unfortunately, that car there was in one of the black areas and was destroyed. So the only thing we have left of it now is this model, which was made by George, his brother, from memory when he was in his 80s. But it's a really detailed model because all the drawings and things were destroyed as well. If that wasn't enough, he invented a new musical scale. He thought the existing one wasn't mathematically correct, so he invented a brand new musical scale and wrote a history about it. And even towards the end of his life, he built a self-steering wheelbarrow in 1941, when he turned his tennis courts into an allotment. By now, he was quite elderly, and in 1946, he died following 2 strokes. The Lanchester name carried on, and the cars were produced until 1956, when Lanchester effectively were just rebadged versions of Daimlers, and so they decided to close down the Lanchester production line. But interestingly, Daimler went on to be bought by Jaguar, and of course, Jaguar are now part of Jaguar Land Rover. And for whatever reason, the current owners, Tata, still own the name to Jaguar, the name to Lanchester. So there is still a Lanchester Motor Company, a registered company. There's £100 in the bank. It's all registered at company's house. So you never know. We might see the name Lanchester come back again. Other names like Lagonda, Maybach have come back in sort of various forms for Aston Martin and Mercedes. So you never know. They've kept onto it for some reason, but we don't know exactly why. So that's sort of the end of the story in terms of Lanchester. Just a little bit about the Lanchester Interactive Archive and where we are in terms of what we hold and what people can get involved with. The main part of the collection is a collection of sketchbooks and notebooks, so large sketchbooks and small notebooks. All these have been scanned and digitized and are available online and can be browsed on the website. And just when I was going through for this talk, there's some really interesting ones in terms of tractors and some of the agricultural machinery. What we do have, obviously, the scans and some of the interesting things that he was interested in. And with the sketchbooks and the notebooks, it's really interesting that his mind is bobbing around all over the place. So you'll have these really detailed sketches like this. And then on a page of a notebook, there'll be a picture of a pterodactyl's wings, because he was interested in how that was flying, or trying to hit the perfect angle for a golf ball. So he was all over this. But what we don't know, and what's a bit of an interesting plea from myself, is we don't have the sort of expert eye on what a lot of this means. So sometimes we'll only have a title, literally tractor 56 horsepower and 57 horsepower engine, and that's all we'll really know about the page. So what you can do is you can go online, have a look at the pages, and there's a link on every single page that says, oh, is there anything that you can sort of help us out with this, or have you noticed something about this page, or does it make sense? So you can leave little comments about those on every single page. And so if you are interested, I do warn you, you can lose hours and hours looking through these, but they are absolutely fascinating. So there's the sketchbooks and the notebooks. There's also the blueprints and the patents. And this is one of his patents from 1904, which was for four-wheel drive. So a four-wheel drive patent. Amongst other things, he had patents for turbocharging, four-wheel drive, disc brakes, power steering, all sorts of things that we see on cars today. We also have the photos. So we were lucky that the brothers decided they'd take quite a lot of photos of what they were doing. And we also have a lot of photos for the manuals and things that were developed for those. And the correspondence. We've got letters. So this is a letter from Wilbur Wright to Fred, talking about some of their ideas. And we have lots of more correspondence from him as well. We have our space that's inside the library. We're not open at the moment. Fingers crossed, we'll be opening soon. But we have a Lanchester car that's there, that's been rebuilt, and our augmented reality and virtual reality as well, which really brings it to life, which is brilliant. It's an app you can download for free, and then hold up your phone or your tablet to one of the pictures, and you'll see some of the ideas come to life, plus some games as well. But our most exciting thing that we've got in the last year is our Lanchester 1518, which was originally, it was one of the first cars to be designed and built in Coventry. So there's a really nice link with the city. It's absolutely fantastic inside. It's been when it was restored before we had it. So we're only the third owners. It was originally for an heiress of the Wills Tobacco Company, and she left it to her chauffeur, and then the chauffeur sold it to the people that we bought it off. So and he had it, the previous owners had it completely and utterly refurbished and restored to just such a fantastic standard. I've had to learn to drive this, and this is just testing it down the Coventry Ring Road. It will fairly happily go at sort of 40-45 miles an hour. The only main issue for me is I'm 6'3", and this was clearly designed for a chauffeur that was about 5'3". The other thing to remember on this one is that we've invested in a 360-degree camera, so we can also do some work with taking this out and about. But the main thing I have to remember on it is that the accelerator and the brake are the opposite way around. So you really have to concentrate because the accelerator is in the middle, and taking it out on the road, you just need to make one mistake and you're quite an expensive mistake. And then the problem is when you get back into your normal car, to go back to remembering where the accelerator and the brake are. So it's got this speaking horn in the middle. It's got a glass. It's quite good for social distancing, actually, because there's a glass screen between the front and the back. So yeah, he was quite a lot of forethought there as well. So I'll just leave on the screen a couple of comments from some of our visitors, but I know I've whipped through that incredibly quickly, but there was an awful lot to get through, and I could probably do another hour, 2 hours, 3 hours on it. But it's just to give a little flavour, really, of Fred and just some of the things he's well known for, and some of the things you might not have known about him. But he's really fascinating. And say somebody who I'd never heard of before I started the job. He's just quite an inspiring, exciting, interesting, and the more you find out, the more you want to know about him. But if you, hopefully at some point in the future, we'll be back open and you can come and visit. But in the meantime, if you want to go online and have a look, you can delve into the archive and literally lose hours in there. But hopefully that's given a little flavour of Fred and what his some of his achievements. So thank you very much. If you've got any questions, then yeah, please we'll go for that.
Okay, that was absolutely fantastic. Can't believe how many patents the guy's got. That's incredible. Yeah. So there is a question. Brian Matthew has a question. If he can unmute yourself.
Yes, indeed. Paul, thank you so much for a wonderful wander through the history of Lanchester and Fred Lanchester. Quite an amazing story. I put a thing up in the chat earlier about wondering whether the fins on the aircraft that you showed would be able to move in that way to help with turning, perhaps. I don't know if there was any thought about that, but my main question actually is about the whole thing of British inventors, because we tend to think of ourselves as a inventive nation. Clearly, Fred was able to get considerable backing during his time, and I've known a few inventors, including the late Trevor Bayliss, who of course invented the wind-up radio. But often it's as much a problem of securing finance, probably more of a problem securing finance to actually make inventions a reality, and perhaps that's more of a problem now than it was in his day.
No, absolutely. I mean, he would certainly in the early days there were sort of small syndicates he'd build up. He was because he was sort of outside of the system. He was not somebody who'd been to Oxford or Cambridge. He was not somebody who had huge amounts of money behind him in terms of any sort of inheritances or anything like that. So he did have to work at getting that investment, and that's probably one of the reasons to say why he went and developed the cars instead of developing the flying machines, because there was no sort of possibility of a business model there. At least there was a business model for building cars, and yeah, very much so. He'd go from one project to another. So he would sort of either be sort of investing things, very small runs of publications and things like that. So yeah, money was he was a fantastic inventor. He was not the greatest when it came to money, managing money and things like that. So yeah, if there's one weakness he had, it was certainly he was certainly not lucky with things like investments and things like that. But no, it's I think we think about inventors and especially in this country. But it's taking that next step. Interestingly, Henry Ford came over to visit and looked at his production, the way he was producing cars, because he was interested in going away from the fact you had to individually coach build every single car, to going through to a production which was much more fluid and much more standardized. And Henry Ford looked at that, took it back across to America. So yeah, it's interesting to see what might have been.
And what about the issue of the fins? Were they locked in position, or could they actually shift?
So yeah, so it's interesting. You can kind of in the patent you can read in that they possibly would have been able to sort of swivel like that. When he was doing his glider tests, pretty much all of his gliders had a fin right at the front, and as well as a tail fin as well. And obviously that's great for stability, but again is very poor for banking and turning. So I think in the patent it talks about some of those fins possibly being optional as well. So it's say when Asita tries to fly it in the simulator, he said it's great in a straight line, but it's why we don't see those fins at the front, I guess.
Right. I guess there's a question that would probably a number of people online today would like to know is, did he ever look at inventing any kind of tractor?
Well, as I say, I mean, this is some of the sketches that when I was looking through, there are certainly some whether he's just interested in them, or whether he was sketching them out, or whether he was very often when you look in the sketchbooks, there's an awful lot of as well as the sketches, there'll be a ream of calculations to go alongside it. So he might just have been analyzing some of the tractors, but there are definitely some sketches and pictures of tractors, some of the details about more to do with things like power output, and you can see a sort of the way his mind's working. So, oh well, if this particular sort of configuration works like that, then how would that apply to something else? Or his pretty much all his cars included a worm gear for transmission, so he was interested in seeing how that worked as well. So yeah, it's there's nothing sort of on the sort of production line of tractors, but certainly delving into the sketchbooks, there's quite a few diagrams and records about those.
Great, thank you very much.
That's right, no problem.
Paul, you have a question?
Yes. Hi, Paul. Just a quick one. I mean, having said there's no technology on tractors, when I started playing about with tractors and stripping engines, in the sump of a lot of four-cylinder tractors of the 60s and 70s, let's say, four-cylinder engines are particularly well balanced. There was a housing on the bottom of the crank bolted on from underneath, which had a pair of eccentric weights, gear-driven, off the crankshaft, called a Lanchester balance.
Yeah, correct. Pretty much.
I mean, the same Lanchester, is it?
That is the same Lanchester. Yeah. So pretty much, pretty much all, four-cylinder or it's the engines like that will have a Lanchester harmonic balancer, and that is his. Yeah. So his technology, as well as will have made at some point somewhere into pretty much most vehicles. I was looking. There was some of his patents referenced. Some of his American patents are then referenced in other patents from General Motors, Citroen, Ford, and they all reference some of his original patents. Even the patents into the 1980s, 90s, 2000s, all referencing earlier patents of his. So you can see a sort of DNA in pretty much every vehicle, I would say.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, the Lanchester balancer was about the only association I had, really. I didn't know, to be honest. But what the value of the car then that you got? What sort of value does it have then?
Well, it's difficult to say, partly because the husband and wife. The husband passed away a few years ago, and the lady who owned it, originally she wanted to give it to us, and we said we can't. We honestly, this is too valuable to give to us. So we did make a contribution to her, but it's the value is. I mean, it's really difficult to say when you look back at the sort of say around that sort of time, a little bit earlier. Obviously the way they were built is you buy the chassis and then you pay the coach builder on top of that. So and you could have whatever design you wanted. So that her design in the back of this one is quite sort of high up windows, but they would have measured those to exactly her specification. And in the back, it's fantastic. I can stretch out in the back of it, but in the front, it's not so comfortable. So yeah, we've. But the nice thing with it is that it's just part of the university fleet. So when our fleet manager, who's the other person who's learned to drive it, just rang up the insurance, said, we've got another car to add on to the university fleet. I said, oh, okay, fine. It's a Lanchester. Right, okay, yeah. And so it's just been that. So it's got a little fuel card and everything. And we just go to, and although when we've been to an event at Gaydon, just in between the sort of lockdowns, and we had to fill up with petrol because it's pre-leaded petrol, so it's actually fine to run on unleaded petrol. And we stopped off at Asda to fill up, and then the person next to us in a Land Rover said, "Oh, is that a Lanchester?" I said, "Yeah, it's a Lanchester." So it's certainly brilliant. Well, it will be brilliant for us in terms of outreach and just sort of making a connection with people because it's such a fantastic vehicle.
University cool car.
Exactly. Yeah, it is. We'll and you know but it's interesting. We'll be able to. There's little things that are great about it. It's also the same model of car that won the first RAC rally in 1931, and the RAC rally was a bit different to how it is today, where it was a sort of timed event where you'd start from about 8 different locations and end up in Torquay. And then there were 3 different tests that they had to take out. It was a rally and concourse exhibition. So it was also about how the car looked. There was an acceleration test, a braking test, and also a slow running test. So the Lanchester was brilliant at this, that it was the car that would go the slowest over 100 yards, so without stopping. And it's got a pre-select gearbox, so it's great. So you can go from forward to reverse, but it means it's got a fluid flywheel, which means you can go very, very slowly, and that's what won it the competition. So it was the first RAC winner to be made.
Excellent. A question from Mr. Cartmel. Do you want to unmute?
Hello there. Sorry. Yeah, it wasn't so much a question. It was just commenting on your comment about innovation and funding. I'm a patent attorney, so I'm seeing it very regularly that people have struggled with funding, and there are companies out there who can help, and there are government incentives as well. Innovate UK is one that's touted very regularly. I just mentioned them in the chat. Innovate UK, it's a government body, and it's well worth looking at for innovation funding. They got various things
going on there. Okay. Simon Cooper, I think I know the answer to your question. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi, Charlie. Yeah. Is that correct?
No, I think you're talking about an Oldham coupling.
Oh, it's an Oldham. That's right. Yes. Yeah, you're correct. My mistake. Oh, shut up.
I know which one you mean, though.
That's good because I didn't know the answer to that. So
yeah, there's a coupling it's an Oldham coupling that takes the drive from the timing gears to the injector pump. Yeah, mate, it's the injector pump that makes all the noise, all the rattling, really noisy things. So you mentioned all those cars, the Maharajas. Presumably some must still be in existence out there.
Yeah, there are. I mean, they've got various laws out there that sort of prevent export of them. So there are quite a few. We've had somebody who's visited the space said, oh, he's been out there, has seen sort of moat houses. Some of them are still on display, but some of them are. I'm sure there are more that are just. I mean, we every so often we'll see ones. They'll be in Malaysia, Singapore. They crop up all over the place. But yeah, there are some barn finds to be found in India and elsewhere. They made it to South Africa and Australia and New Zealand as well. But yeah, it's there's somewhere, someone somewhere. There are some, you know, some big 40 horsepower Lanchesters that are waiting to be discovered. But they were all sorts of innovations on those. They were, you know, I've seen one which you could fit a whole cricket team in. So it's just a huge car. And some of the designs with slatted windows for the wives, the Maharanis, to be transported around in. So they had these Purda cars, which would have either slatted windows or smoked screens as well. So that's where our tinted windows come from. So yeah.
Amazing. Any more questions? We've got a couple of minutes, I think. Do you get how many visitors do you expect to get through then?
It's difficult to say. I mean, yeah, since March we've had 0, so it's a little bit tricky. But where we are, I mean, we're trying to get out and about as much as possible. So things like we're quite lucky where we are in terms of being in Coventry. So there's an annual Motor Fest which normally takes place. We've got Gaydon just down the road from us as well. So. And being able to take the car out is going to be a really big thing for us, and also take it into schools and things like that, which is another one of the areas where we really look at sort of inspiring children, especially that sort of age where they're making decisions about like GCSE choices and things like options and stuff like that, where, you know, there's a lot of pressure to already be channeled into one particular sort of career. But somebody like Fred can say, well, you know, you can do the poetry, you can do the science, you can do all of the stuff really. You don't get, you know, don't get locked down so early on. Just as long as, you know, you're creative and can think like that, then you can do anything really. So yeah, I can't wait to get back out and do some more of that really.
Excellent. Hugh, I think sorry, I missed you. You raised your hand, didn't you?
I did. Yeah, well, just a couple of things. I just picking up the earlier discussion about the vertical fins on a flying surface. There are aircraft around today that have vertical fins as a turning surface. In fact, I've had the dubious pleasure of not only attempting to fly one, but also crashing one in my idle youth. It was an aircraft called a pterodactyl, which had a forward canard, which meant that it was impossible to stall, because if you took your hand off the stick and you started to descend rapidly, the canard flipped up and turned the aircraft up into a climb elevation again. Anyway, the point was the turning of the aircraft was on 2 vertical fins on the wings, and I can tell you they were bloody hard work to control, because you're turning a vertical fin directly into the airflow. And that, of course, was why I ended up crashing the aircraft, because I thought I was applying sufficient correctional control by throwing the stick to the left. The guy who was watching on the ground before radio connection to the solo pilot, I'd only been in this thing about 25 minutes, by the way. and was screaming from the ground, "You haven't got full control." But by that time, the wingtip had touched the ground, and I did the aeronautical equivalent of a handbrake turn on the field, and that brought our afternoon's flying to a close. On the subject, the value of the Lanchester. Lanchester is a very recherche vehicle, and until vehicles. Unless vehicles have got a particular provenance that are not the sort of popular climbing value classics or old cars, then you'll be surprised how little they go for sometimes, and indeed how much they go for if they happen to have a particular provenance. But I would think the vehicle that you've got would be less than 100 grand. I would imagine it will be sitting in this sort of 50, 60, 70 grand kind of, and that's if there happens to be a bit of competition for it. And I did a little bit of research while you were chatting, and there are quite a lot of Lanchesters that have been in sales at around 10 grand. So I mean, it's not the particular model that you've got, but it's surprising how little they go for and how much they go for at the same time.
Yeah, it's yeah, there was a certainly the early one. So the sort of the pre 1930, the sort of proper Lanchesters before they were sort of part of BSA, are certainly worth more. And one has just gone at auction, and a 40 horsepower one just gone at auction for about, I think, 56 or 58,000 pounds. And that's I've seen that one, and it is stunning. But yeah, it's not, you know, if it was a Bentley or a Rolls Royce, you could at the moment you could name your price, but they're just, it's interesting. Originally, they were priced pretty much at Rolls Royce prices, and the sort of the day-to-day cars were, they were doctors and lawyers' cars. They were the equivalent BSA or the equivalent Daimler were, 30% cheaper, and so they had a little bit of cachet, but they were never huge bulk sellers. They were never huge bulk sellers. I've just popped a link into the chat, which takes you to that patent, the 1897 patent. So if you want to have a dig around and have a look at that 1897 patent, you can download it as a PDF and print it off as well, so you can have a look. So you can see, certainly on the diagrams, it looks like it's possible they could have had the swiveling sort of uprights fins.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thanks very much for a fantastic presentation. I knew about Lanchester in general through automobiles because I have a particular interest in old automobiles. I had absolutely no clue at all the places where his fingers reached and touched, and indeed what an influential engineer he was. Clearly.
Yeah, I mean that's if you do know about cars, you've probably heard of him in relation to cars.
Oh.
When we talk to the aeronautics guys, they know nothing about the cars, but know him for the absolute fundamentals. And then, it's very few. That's why the sort of the LA is there, really, because to give an idea of all the things that he did. Probably he'd be better known if he'd have done one thing and just done that. People would have heard of him, but because he spread himself so thin, perhaps that's why when we call, he's been known as Britain's Leonardo da Vinci, and he's probably not far wrong. I mean, the only person I could probably think of today he might be vaguely similar to would be somebody like Elon Musk, but I don't know what Elon Musk's poetry is like, so maybe not.
Okay, well, absolutely amazing story, brilliant. Thanks for sharing that. So we've come up to an hour now, so we need to draw it to a close. So thank you, Paul, for taking some time out to present that.
Thank you very much.
I think we all found it fascinating. I was just amazed at how many inventions one person can have, and how many things he's touched. Incredible. So before we close, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today, and hope you will join us for our next lecture on the 12th of January, where Kit Franklin from Harper Adams, who's also a founder member of the Hands-Free Hectare project, is going to be talking about robots and redefining the future of farming. So that will be very interesting. So I hope you can join us for that. So all that's left to say is thanks again to everybody for joining. Merry Christmas, best wishes to you and all your families for the new year, and we'll see you next time. Okay, bye-bye.